The city skyline glowed against the evening haze as Eleanor Carter adjusted the stiff collar of her janitor's uniform. The fabric felt foreign against her skin, a stark contrast to the tailored suits she usually wore. She took a steadying breath, staring at her reflection in the smudged glass of a subway window. The woman staring back was unrecognizable. Gone was the commanding presence of Carter Tech's formidable CEO. In her place stood Ellen Cross, a middle-aged blue-collar worker with weary eyes and calloused hands. She stepped off the train, the air thick with the scent of damp pavement and diesel fumes, and made her way toward the towering glass facade of her own empire. Tonight marked the beginning of her deception. For weeks, she had suspected a disconnect between her executives' reports and the reality of her company's workforce. The quarterly meetings spoke of efficiency and growth, but the whispers, anonymous complaints, reports of unfair terminations, and salary discrepancies suggested otherwise. She had built this company with a promise of integrity, yet now she felt like a stranger in its halls. At the employee entrance, she presented a forged ID badge. The security guard barely glanced at her before waving her through, confirming what she already suspected. Janitors were invisible here. No greetings, no second glances. Just another body passing through. Inside, the stark fluorescent lights of the service corridors revealed a world she had never seen. The pristine corporate offices above masked the reality below, faded walls, peeling paint, and a lingering scent of industrial cleaner. A group of custodial workers clustered near the supply room, their laughter subdued, their faces worn from long shifts. The cold hum of the office at night became familiar, the artificial glow of monitors casting eerie shadows on the walls. Eleanor moved through the corridors with practiced ease now, her mop and bucket nothing more than props in the role she had fully embraced. She no longer thought of the stiff fabric of her uniform or the ache in her back from hours of scrubbing floors. Those were small prices to pay for what she was uncovering. Frank had returned to his routine, his silent despair neatly packed away behind forced smiles and tired nods. But Eleanor saw the way he flinched whenever he checked his phone, the dread pooling in his eyes, as if expecting the worst news at any moment. His words haunted her. "Payroll's been messing with my checks. Says there were deductions I don't remember agreeing to." That night, she slipped into the break room where a few janitors lingered over stale coffee, their voices low and weary. She eased into the background, listening. The murmurs were scattered, but the message was the same. Paychecks running short. Overtime hours mysteriously missing. Deductions for vague company fees that had never been explained. "It's been happening for months," one worker muttered. "Ever since they brought in that new payroll system." Another scoffed. "New system, my ass. It's just another way to cut corners." Eleanor tightened her grip on the mop handle. She had trusted the numbers reported to her, the polished presentations from her executives assuring her that everything was running smoothly. But she was beginning to see the rot beneath the surface. Later that night, while the office was empty, she made her move. The executive floor was off limits to janitorial staff, but she had watched enough to know the security patterns, the times when the cameras rotated. She slipped into the finance department, her pulse steady despite the risk. Rows of cubicles stood silent, the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air. She moved quickly, scanning the monitors left in sleep mode. Then, at the far end of the room, she found what she was looking for, a spreadsheet left open, its glowing numbers whispering secrets into the dark. She leaned in, eyes scanning the data. Her name wasn't on the payroll, but Frank's was. So were the names of dozens of other janitors. And next to each of them, deductions. Hundreds siphoned away each month under vague labels. Policy adjustments, administrative fees, performance penalties. Her stomach churned. This wasn't an error. It was deliberate theft. Footsteps echoed from the hallway. She dropped into a crouch, pressing herself against the desk as the soft murmur of voices approached. "Got another batch processed today," a man chuckled. "Can you believe it? These idiots don't even notice." A second voice, sharp and amused. "You think they'd complain more, but they're too scared of losing their jobs." A slow rage burned through Eleanor's veins. The voices belonged to Greg Mason and Adam Pierce, mid-level managers in payroll. She had trusted them, approved their raises. And here they were, treating human lives like numbers in a ledger. The men strolled into the office, their laughter casual, careless. Eleanor remained frozen behind a cubicle, listening. Whitmore says the CEO is gonna love the cost-cutting results next quarter, Greg said. Too bad she has no clue how we're doing it. A laugh. Well, that's what happens when you run a company from the top of an ivory tower. Eleanor clenched her fists, nails biting into her palms. They think I don't see. They think I don't know. She stayed hidden as they passed, their conversation fading into the distance. When the room was silent again, she rose, careful and controlled. She had heard enough. Back in the janitorial closet, she found Frank finishing up his shift, his hands red from scrubbing chemicals. He barely looked up as she entered, too exhausted to care. How long have they been doing this to you? She asked quietly. Frank glanced at her. What? The payroll deductions. The missing overtime. How long? His brows furrowed. Why does it matter? Because it's not an accident. Something flickered in his expression. Hope, wariness, anger. You don't know that. Yes, I do. She hesitated, then softened her voice. And I can prove it. For the first time in days, Frank met her gaze fully. What are you saying? I'm saying that this isn't over. The weight of her words settled between them. Frank said nothing, but there was something different in his eyes now. Something that hadn't been there before. A spark. New girl, a voice grunted. She turned to find a stocky man in a faded work shirt, his mop slung over his shoulder like a soldier resting his weapon. Yeah, she said, keeping her voice low. Ellen. Frank, he replied, squinting at her with quiet curiosity. You from another building? Something like that. He nodded, not prying further, and handed her a mop. You'll start on the 22nd floor. Offices, break rooms, and make sure to check the bathrooms. Some of these suits act like they were raised in barns. She forced a smile, took the mop, and made her way to the service elevator. The moment the doors slid shut, she exhaled sharply. The air in the confined space felt thick, pressing against her ribs. She was out of her element, out of control. And yet, she had never felt closer to the truth. The 22nd floor was eerily quiet at this hour, the soft hum of computers the only sound. The offices were immaculate, the desks adorned with framed photos and personalized trinkets. Yet, as she pushed her mop across the gleaming tile, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then she heard it. A muffled sound, sharp, uneven, like someone trying to breathe through broken sobs. She froze, gripping the mop handle tighter, her pulse quickening. Slowly, she followed the sound, weaving past the empty desks, until she reached a storage closet at the far end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, she saw him. Frank. He sat on an overturned bucket, shoulders hunched, his hands trembling as he clutched a crumpled piece of paper. His breath hitched, a quiet, guttural sound that made something inside her twist. She had seen desperation before, negotiating high-stakes deals, watching competitors crumble under financial ruin. But this was different. This was raw, human. She hesitated, then knocked lightly on the doorframe. Frank jolted, hastily wiping his eyes before stuffing the paper into his pocket. Didn't think anyone else was still up here, he muttered, his voice thick. She leaned against the doorframe, trying to keep her tone casual. Just finishing up. He nodded, but said nothing, staring at the floor. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Long day, she asked gently. He let out a hollow chuckle. Something like that. She could have walked away. Should have. But something about the way his fingers clenched around the paper made her stay. I know it's not my business, she said carefully, but you okay? Frank hesitated. Then, with a weary sigh, he pulled the paper from his pocket and handed it to her. She unfolded it, her stomach sinking as she read the bolded words at the top. Final notice, eviction. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the page. Frank. 2 weeks, he said quietly. That's all I've got before they lock me out. Been working doubles, picking up shifts wherever I can. But, he shook his head. Payroll's been messing with my checks. Says there were deductions I don't remember agreeing to. I tried talking to HR, but they just keep giving me the runaround. A slow, burning anger coiled in Eleanor's chest. She had heard whispers about payroll discrepancies before, but seeing the consequence of it firsthand, watching a man crumble under its weight, was different. Frank exhaled sharply, as if trying to shake off his own vulnerability. Forget it. Not like there's anything you can do. But there was. And she would. Eleanor folded the eviction notice carefully and placed it back in his hand. You deserve better than this, she said, meeting his tired eyes. Frank gave her a weak smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. Yeah, well, life's funny like that. As she turned to leave, a cold determination settled over her. She had come here for answers. Now she had them. But the real battle was just beginning. Eleanor spent the next 24 hours in careful, calculated silence. Every instinct screamed for action, for immediate justice. But she knew better than to storm in without proof. She had seen how power worked, how the guilty squirmed free when accusations lacked the weight of evidence. So she bided her time, gathering what she needed. Screenshots of payroll discrepancies. Copies of emails subtly instructing deductions. Security footage of Greg Mason and Adam Pierce boasting about their scheme in the finance office after hours. By the time she was ready, the noose had already tightened around their necks. The moment arrived on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. The office hummed with routine, oblivious to the storm rolling in. Eleanor, still dressed in her janitor's uniform, made her way toward HR, her pulse steady, her mind sharp. Mr. Whitmore sat in his corner office, his expression one of perpetual condescension. He barely glanced up as she entered. What do you need? He asked, irritation laced in his tone. She placed a payroll statement on his desk. I have some concerns. Whitmore sighed, rubbing his temple. If this is about overtime requests, take it up with your supervisor. Eleanor didn't move. It's about missing wages, unauthorized deductions, hundreds of dollars taken from employees under false pretenses. At that, Whitmore looked up, the irritation in his eyes sharpening into something colder. We have policies, miss. Ellen Cross. She folded her arms. And I know the policies. I also know that none of them justify stealing from employees. Whitmore's lip curled. You don't understand company finance. These are standard deductions. She leaned forward. No, they're not. And you know it. A flicker of discomfort crossed his face, but it was gone in an instant, replaced with something smug. If you have a problem with your paycheck, file a complaint. Otherwise, I suggest you get back to work. She smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in days. That's the thing, Mr. Whitmore. I don't work for you. She reached up and unclipped her ID badge, tossing it onto his desk. Whitmore's gaze flickered to it, confusion knitting his brow. Then his eyes widened. Because the name on the badge was real. Eleanor Carter. Silence swallowed the room. Whitmore paled, his posture stiffening. This is some kind of joke. Eleanor straightened, the authority in her stance undeniable. I wish it were. Unfortunately, I've spent the last 2 weeks watching my own company steal from its most vulnerable employees. I've listened to my managers laugh about it. I've seen workers break under the weight of it. She tapped the payroll document. And I have evidence to prove it. Whitmore swallowed hard, but before he could open his mouth, the door behind them swung open. Greg Mason and Adam Pierce strode in, their casual arrogance evaporating the moment they spotted Eleanor. What the hell is? Greg started, then stopped, his face draining of color. Eleanor turned to face them fully. Gentlemen, so glad you could join us. Adam's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Ms. Carter, we. Save it. She picked up a folder from Whitmore's desk, flipping it open. Payroll discrepancies. Fraudulent deductions. Unauthorized fees. And, let's not forget, your little conversation in the finance department the other night. Greg's fingers twitched at his side. You have no right. I have every right, she said coolly. This is my company. And you've been robbing my employees. Whitmore's hands clenched into fists. We were optimizing costs, Ms. Carter. We were doing what was best for the company. Her laugh was sharp, humorless. Best for the company? You mean best for you. Best for your bonuses. Best for your personal ledgers. She let the folders snap shut. You think I don't know how these things work? You thought I'd never notice. Adam took a cautious step forward, desperation creeping into his voice. It's not as bad as you think. It's worse than I think, Eleanor cut in. And it ends today. She reached for the intercom on Whitmore's desk and pressed the button that would broadcast across the entire office. Attention Carter Tech employees. This is Eleanor Carter. Effective immediately, Greg Mason, Adam Pierce, and Thomas Whitmore have been terminated. A full internal audit will begin today. Any employees affected by payroll discrepancies are urged to report to the finance department. Your wages will be restored. No more silence. No more theft. She released the button. The office was deathly quiet. Greg sputtered. You can't just fire us like this. Eleanor leveled him with a look so cold he took a step back. I just did. Security entered a moment later, their presence solid and unquestionable. Whitmore turned as if to protest, but one glance at Eleanor's expression told him there would be no negotiation. He was done. As they were escorted out, Eleanor exhaled slowly, the weight of weeks lifting from her shoulders. But she wasn't done yet. She had promises to keep. And one of them was waiting down in the janitor's break room. The hush that followed the announcement felt heavier than the roar of chaos it replaced. Eleanor Carter stood in the center of the office she had built, watching the aftershocks of her words ripple through the employees who had once been strangers to her. Some exchanged stunned glances. Others sat frozen at their desks, processing what had just happened. And then, as if a dam had broken, the murmurs began, small at first, then swelling into a tide of voices. She could hear it. Relief, hope, and, buried deep beneath years of conditioned silence, the stirrings of something she hadn't realized had been missing in her company. Trust. But there was still one more thing she needed to do. With a final glance at the glass-walled offices where her former managers had once ruled with unchecked greed, Eleanor turned and strode toward the service elevators. Her reflection flickered in the polished steel doors as they slid open. No longer Ellen Cross, the janitor, but Eleanor Carter, the CEO. Yet she felt different from the woman who had stood at the top of this company weeks ago. The descent to the lower levels felt longer than usual. When the doors opened, the scent of industrial cleaner filled her lungs, grounding her in the reality of where this journey had started. The janitor's break room was small, dimly lit, with scuffed tables and chairs that had seen better days. It was a stark contrast to the executive lounges upstairs, but the people inside mattered more to her now than any boardroom ever had. Frank was there, hunched over a cup of vending machine coffee, staring blankly at the table. He didn't look up when she entered, and for a moment she hesitated. After everything, would he believe her? She cleared her throat. Frank. His head snapped up. His eyes, weary and dulled by years of exhaustion, narrowed slightly as he took her in. She had removed the janitor's uniform, replacing it with the sharp lines of the suit that marked her true identity. For a long moment, he just stared at her. Then, slowly, he set his cup down. So it was you. Eleanor took a step closer, choosing her words carefully. It was. A humorless chuckle left his lips as he shook his head. Damn. Thought you looked out of place. I was. She exhaled. And I'm sorry. His brows furrowed. For what? For not seeing it sooner. She pulled out a chair across from him and sat down, meeting his gaze head on. For trusting the wrong people. For letting it happen in the first place. Frank leaned back, arms crossing over his chest. His silence stretched, weighing the sincerity in her words. Finally, he nodded. So what happens now? She placed a folder on the table and slid it toward him. He hesitated before flipping it open, his eyes scanning the contents. A breath hitched in his throat. This is my back pay. With interest. Eleanor leaned forward. And not just yours. Everyone's. the deductions, the missing wages, it's all being restored. Frank's hands trembled as he gripped the papers. His jaw tightened, as if fighting to hold back the emotions surging beneath the surface. You actually did it. She nodded. I had to. A quiet laugh escaped him, but there was no bitterness in it this time. Just disbelief. Relief. Damn. He exhaled. So what now? You gonna go back upstairs and pretend this never happened? Eleanor's lips pressed together. No, she glanced around the break room, at the men and women who had spent years being overlooked. Things are changing. She met his gaze again. And I want you to help me. Frank frowned. Help you? You know the workers better than I do, she said simply. You know what's wrong, what needs fixing. I want you on the employee advisory board. A real seat at the table. His eyes widened. You're serious? As serious as I was when I fired Whitmore. Frank let out a slow whistle, shaking his head. I never saw this coming. She smiled, a small but genuine curve of her lips. Neither did I. He looked at her for a long moment, then slowly reached out and shook her hand. His grip was strong, steady. Guess we've got work to do, boss. Eleanor nodded. For the first time in years, the title didn't feel so distant.